Face financial ruin in drought-hit Cooper's Crossing in this week's episode of The Flying Doctors. Now on BBC One, the news with Moira Stewart.
The headlines this evening: Labour say they're telling the truth when they talk of hospitals opting out of the NHS. The Prime Minister will repeat his charge tonight of Labour lies. Helen Sharman blasts off to become the first Briton in space. And an own goal gives Spurs the cup. Gascoigne leaves on a stretcher. Good evening. Labour have stuck firmly to their charge that self-governing hospitals are effectively opting out of the NHS, as the Conservatives renew their accusation that Labour's lying. In a series of bitter exchanges, Labour accused the government of being bad losers in the Monmouth by-election. The Tories said Labour were scaring people to win votes.
A trip to the Cup final gave the Prime Minister a break from the unpleasant exchanges between his government and the opposition. Later tonight he'll be back in the fray with a speech maintaining the attack on Labour's campaign in the Monmouth by-election, part of a concerted Tory onslaught.
Labour should be asked which hospitals that have become NHS trusts have left the NHS. Answer: none. Nor can they. There's no legal power to do so. We don't want them to do so. They should stop using that lie now.
But Labour won't back down from the controversial claims they made in Monmouth. Hospital trusts, they repeat, are opting out of the NHS.
These hospitals are no longer owned by the NHS. The staff in them are no longer employed by the NHS. They are no longer managed by any health authority. The government has made these hospitals opt out in every sense of the word. And if you want the final proof of that, look at the way that when Guys ran into trouble, William Walgrave just did not want to know and said it was no longer his responsibility. You can't have it both ways.
The Liberal Democrats have accused Labour of getting their facts wrong and condemned the government for poor presentation.
Is wrong on both sides. Truth is that the government's referred to opted out schools as opted out when they stayed within the public education system but took their own management on. And they really can't blame people if people apply the same term to exactly the same thing happening with the hospital service.
Mr Major will define the health argument as he sees it in robust terms tonight and repeat his charge that Labour lied in Monmouth. Despite continued Labour taunts that he's whinging and a bad loser, Mr Major clearly wants to settle matters with Mr Kinnock.
Britain's first astronaut is in space. Early this afternoon, the Soyuz spacecraft was launched successfully from the Baikonur Space Center in the Soviet Union, carrying Helen Sharman and 2 Soviet cosmonauts.
The pre-launch ritual is well established here. Helen Sharman and the 2 Soviet crewmen emerged for a brief formal send-off. Helen was said to be in good spirits, but just a little apprehensive. There was some encouragement from her understudy Tim Mace before she boarded the bus for the launch pad. 2.5 hours before liftoff, on board Soyuz TM-12, the crew began the long series of final checks. Much of the navigational data was Helen's responsibility. The launch was precisely on time. Within 9 minutes, the Soyuz rocket successfully entered its first orbit around the Earth. Inside the cramped capsule, Helen Sharman became the first Briton to enter space. 30 years after the first manned spaceflight, this may not be a major scientific breakthrough. But for her family, watching at the launch site, it was of course a very emotional moment.
She looked so calm and she was just doing everything she was taught to do.
Even at the second stage of rocket, she had the presence of mind to wave.
In 2 days' time, the spacecraft is due to dock with the orbiting Mir space station. Helen Sharman will spend just a few days working with 2 Soviet cosmonauts who've been in space for many months. Carol Walker, BBC News, at the Baikonur spaceport.
The African National Congress says it won't take part in constitutional talks until the South African government ends the fighting in black townships. The ANC is to hold demonstrations and call a national strike to put pressure on President de Klerk.
The ANC decision means that full negotiations with the government on ending white rule may now be delayed. They've not yet started, and the ANC says other contacts with the government will continue. But the organisation will launch strikes and demonstrations on June the 15th, backing its demands for tougher government action to end the township violence.
There cannot be any major move to a constitutional dialogue unless these demands are met.
The major sticking point, the reluctance of the government to ban the carrying of spears. In Carter's Chief Buthelezi says spears are crucial to Zulu culture. 800 people have died in the townships this year. Last Sunday in Kahiso, 28 were massacred by Inkatha, the ANC's rivals. Latest evidence for the ANC that security forces do too little to stop the fighting and that some elements positively help Inkatha on the ground. Nelson Mandela has never been angrier, moving towards the hardliners in his organisation. But the ANC is still committed to negotiations, and the delay in talks, although dangerous, is unlikely to be permanent.
Douglas Brand, the British engineer given a life sentence on spying charges in Iraq, has been visited in jail by a Soviet diplomat looking after British interests there. Mr. Brand was in good spirits and sent messages to his family, and he told the diplomat he denied the charges made against him at his secret trial in Baghdad, which ended last Thursday. The first United Nations security guards will take up their position tomorrow in Kurdish areas of northern Iraq. An initial contingent of 10 passed through Baghdad today on their way to Dahouk, where they'll guard a transit camp for refugees. And after 2 weeks of talks in Baghdad, Kurdish rebel leaders say they're close to a deal with the Iraqi government on setting up an autonomous Kurdistan, but it's still not been agreed how big an area it would cover. Football, and both the English and Scottish Cup finals went to extra time. At Wembley, Tottenham Hotspur beat Nottingham Forest despite having Paul Gascoigne carried off early in the match.
A memorable cup final, and one which after only 14 minutes was to produce an extraordinary twist as Paul Gascoigne made a disastrous first and last contribution by felling Crosby in reckless fashion. Stuart Pearce was the man to punish it with Gaza-style ferocity. 1-0 Forest, and Gascoigne, injured in the challenge, was to play no further part, ending up being taken to hospital. In the second half, after Lineker had failed from the penalty spot, Spurs did get a deserved equaliser, Naeem and Allen setting up the outstanding Stewart. Ultimately, that was to mean extra time, which had been running just 4 minutes when Spurs went ahead. Walker's calamitous own goal giving Spurs the cup for a record 8th time.
At Hampden Park, Dundee United clawed their way back from 3-1 down against Motherwell, and Darren Jackson's last-minute goal meant there was extra time in the Tennent's Scottish final as well. But Motherwell's resilience on an afternoon of rapidly changing fortunes was quickly rewarded, Steve Kirk scoring as a substitute for the third round running to make it 4-3. This time Motherwell held on to take the cup for the second time in their history.
The main news tonight, 9:10.